Sometimes, though, to see the blessing of something, right, to see the fruit of our labor, to recognize the destination from the journey, I think we first must engage in a faithful act of trust. Trusting action that God calls us to receive a blessing. And oftentimes, that call to engage in some action, it's going to take us out of our comfort zone. Okay? It's going to challenge us in some way. And we're looking at this morning because on July 4th weekend, I took a very diverse group of people down the Deschutes River. And so this was made of 541 youth, parents. If you look up in the top left, you'll see Liz and Rose and Oscar. The seniors were just in there, and there was no fear. But they did such a marvelous job. And this rafting expedition kind of became the anchor point in my discussion of stewardship today in kind of an interesting way. But what I found on the river is that you do have to engage in trusting acts of faith in order to receive a blessing. Because before we could get to this place on the bottom right where we could enjoy a swim, those people were out of the boat on purpose, okay? They were floating down the river enjoying that. Before we did that, we had to trust the guide over these waterfalls and to lead us through class 3 rapids and class 4 rapids. And honestly, in that middle bottom picture, when our boat was totally swamped by water, you can see the guide holding a paddle up as if to say, we're okay. It didn't feel that way in the moment, but it was great. And we saw through that there's this relationship of receiving a blessing when we are engaging in faithful action. And so our theme today is that God is on the move, showing us stewardship. God is on the move, showing us stewardship. And like I said, in a way, this river trip was tied to that. I want to give you the definition of stewardship, okay? So listen to this. This is good. The definition of stewardship is the job of supervising or taking care of something such as an organization or a property. The job of supervising or taking care of something such as an organization or a property. Now, keep that in mind because we're going to shift gears a little bit, but keep this rafting expedition in your head because I'm going to go back to this a little bit. In our Old Testament reading today, we see God taking care of Israel as their steward. And so he's teaching us what stewardship looks like. And how is this expressed in the Old Testament passage? It's expressed in the Passover itself, where we read in Wisdom 18:6 and 9, the night of the Passover was known beforehand to the fathers, for in secret the holy children of the good were offering a sacrifice and putting into effect with one accord the divine institution. That divine institution, the Passover. Well, what was the act that they had to engage in before they were going to see a blessing? They had to sacrifice a lamb. They had to take the blood of that sacrificed lamb and put it on the door frames of their house. Why? So that when the angel of death came through, it would pass by their house. And we know that eventually led to the Israelites being freed from Egyptian slavery. So they were slaves in Egypt at that time, and after all this happened, they were called out into the wilderness with Moses leading them, and they were able to do what? To worship God freely. They were able to sojourn to the land. They were able to enjoy life as a nation in freedom. And so they had to first engage in this action. I was thinking, well, what actions did I engage in on the river that led to some sort of blessing? Well, at the very beginning, the guide's like, okay, I'm going to tell you what to do, when to paddle, how to paddle, and the whole bit. And if you follow my instructions, we're going to be fine on this river. I said, okay. So what were the instructions? Well, she had simple instructions. One was paddle left. Everybody paddled on the left, right? And the right side had to stop. Or paddle right, and you paddled right. Or everybody forward, everybody paddle forward. Or everybody back, and everybody paddle really important because sometimes, right, you were called to do something that didn't make any sense. And I'm sure that to the Israelites, sacrificing a lamb, putting blood on their door, it probably didn't make much sense. The thing was, they had to engage in this act with faithful trust. So on the river, there we are. She's saying, paddle forward. We're heading for a rock. I'm like, what do you mean paddle forward? She paddle forward. We're paddling forward. Well, you know, in rafting, you can paddle towards a rock, and your front can go up on that rock, and it can spin your boat around and put you in a better position for the next rapid. That seems very counterintuitive, but there's a blessing in following the guide and doing that, and you end up where you're supposed to be. And so that was kind of an interesting thing. Well, how do we see this play out in the New Testament letter? I'm so glad you asked, right? Because in the letter to the Hebrews, similarly, we see God's plan to further care for Israel as their steward. And remember, God is showing us how to be stewards, right? And so what is he doing? He's providing Israel with a promised land as their inheritance. And so we read in Hebrews 11, 1 through 2, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. He went out, not knowing where he was to go. By faith, he sojourned in the promised land. And did you notice what had to precede the receiving of that blessing of the promised land? Oh, yes, once again, he had to engage in a faithful act of trust that he had no idea what it was about, where it was leading. He had no idea. He had to go out, it says, in faith he sojourned in the promised land. He did this by faith. And I bet you there was times when Abraham was leading his whole family and all his stock and wildlife across the wilderness to the promised land, that he probably felt ill-equipped for that call. Have you ever felt ill-equipped for something God was calling you to do? Like, oh man, I'm not ready to do this. And there's this kind of thing that we share in the ministry, like God will never call you to do something you can't handle, blah, blah, blah. I think that's false, actually. I really do. I think oftentimes God calls us to things that we feel ill-equipped to do and unable to handle ourselves. Why? Because it puts us exactly where we need to be as prayerful followers of Christ, in a place of total reliance on God showing up in the equation, right? When we can't do it on our own, by our own plans, by our own strategies and all this, when we feel like we're in a situation where we need to totally rely on God, doesn't that put us in a prayerful state? Doesn't that put us in a worshipful state? Could that possibly be by design? I think it can. And so engaging once again in this act of humble, faithful trust, engaging in actions without really knowing how it's going to turn out, this is important. And we saw this yesterday with the Hope event, didn't we? Okay, you say, well, I didn't see you there, Father David. Well, I was there. Let me tell you how I was there. My phone was going off like every 5 minutes from the cameras that are in there. And so I would look and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of people there. Wow, I don't even recognize some of these people. And then I took the little volume thing on and I could hear her speaking a little bit. I'm like, that's pretty interesting. And I like went on. And so I was busy, but I was kind of in and out there. And I was thinking, wow, look at all that's coming out of this. Look at this outreach. All these people have engaged in these faithful acts of trust, getting this place all ready, putting it all together. And look at how the Holy Spirit acted in all that. Because see, here's the cool thing about acting in faith. We have the big piece of the equation that we don't see is the Holy Spirit, right? We can do all kinds of stuff in a prayerful way, and we can engage in these acts of faith not knowing how they're going to turn out, but something wonderful and amazing happens when the Holy Spirit gets involved and begins to pour out His Spirit of grace on things. It's like unpredictable, right? And so I love that. And again, we see here how Abraham is displaying this as he's just basically picked up his whole family and he's moving forward in this sojourn, faithfully trusting that whatever God's calling him to do, God is going to care for him in the process. But in the act of not knowing, he has to rely and stay faithful. And so we see this again in the New Testament. Fast forward to the New Testament, we see Jesus is talking to the disciples, and Peter is wanting to know more about this parable that Jesus has just kind of unpacked. And so he asked Jesus about it, and Jesus says in Luke 12:43 and 44, "Blessed is that servant whom his master on arrival finds doing so. Truly I say to you, the master will put the servant in charge of all his property." So even in the New Testament, we see the master's blessing comes after the steward engages in faithful act of service. And so we start to see the teaching kind of shift around from God showing us what it means to be a steward to God calling us to be those stewards. And how do we see that kind of playing out in our life, in our ministry? We see it in some really interesting ways, because as we engage in faithful acts in the ministry, we give opportunity for God to bless it. Whether that engaging in faithful trust comes through the giving of our time in some way, of our treasure, well, we don't know how the Lord's going to use that, in our talents, it could be anything. God calls us to be stewards of this mission, co-partners of what's going on here with the Holy Spirit in Bend, as we, the church, join forces with the Holy Spirit to do these things. And it takes a lot of trust, right? It takes moving forward without maybe seeing the results. It takes trust in what God is going to bless and do through the work that we do. And we saw that so clearly yesterday. Even some of the people that were here all day stayed even for the Mass. And I was like, wow, that is just something beautiful. And so, what about regular life, right? Not just ministry stuff. Don't we see it in regular life that we have to engage in these faithful acts of trust to receive a blessing on something? Let's just dial it down to something really physical and mundane. I want to be, say, a successful, or you want to be a successful financier, right? How do you go about that? You have to engage in faithful acts of trust. That faithful action might be going to college. It might be getting a trade. It might be investing and starting a business. It might be this or that. But there's going to be certain things that you're going to be called to do to get from point A to point B to receive the blessing. And so it's very practical. It's very practical to move forward and trust as a good steward in all that we do. And so my question this morning is this: what is God calling us to right now in this moment? You answer that for yourself. What's God calling you to do? Is there some act of faithful trust that you've been struggling with? And God's saying, if you'll just engage in this faithful act of trust, there might be a blessing to follow? And oftentimes we feel that, but we let the fear get huge, right? And so this morning I'm saying, let's follow the Bible. Let's follow and trust. Let's engage in those actions, even if we don't understand them, even if we feel ill-equipped, and let's see how God blesses that in our lives and in our church, in our ministry. Because I think that we'll be called to do special things in our church that maybe we won't understand, or maybe we'll feel ill-equipped to handle, or maybe seems bigger than we can do on our own. Hey, what? You know what? That's the best thing. That means we're going to be in a situation where we need to rely on God. And that's going to be a nice walk for us. So, what's God calling us to today? Whatever that is, let's be good stewards.